Hi everyone! Today I'm going to talk about 12 sourdough rules that you can break without feeling bad, that maybe you should break, at least on occasion. And my main goal here is to actually tell you that sourdough is a flexible process. You don't need a science degree, you don't need to leave your job, you don't need all the fancy tools under the sun to make good bread at home, because I think there's a lot of rules that are too intimidating for some people, especially when they're first starting out. And I think you learn sourdough with practice. So starting out is necessary to get into the process, to see what it works for you, to see how to fit it into your schedule. I'm on maternity leave right now, but I did bake with sourdough even when I was working outside the home, and it's totally possible. Now I think it's actually easier than just baking with yeast. My point here is that a lot of those rules are taken out of the context, or maybe just downright not true. And while some people that have micro bakeries or are making bread for other people, they need to have a predictable process. So they may be temping their dough and have a really strict schedule about their prep days, dough days, bake days. But for just a regular home baker, for a mom that wants to bake good quality bread with her starter at home, there's really very few rules you have to abide by. So I gathered 12 rules that I see all the time, and I will talk a bit about why you should maybe just ignore them sometimes. So the first rule I often hear about is that you have to feed your sourdough starter every day. While this is true if you keep it on a kitchen counter, and I think you should probably feed it maybe even twice a day if you really keep it on your kitchen counter. At least my starter is like that. If I would have it at room temperature at all times, I know I would probably need to feed it every 12 hours or so. So keeping a sourdough starter in the fridge is a good strategy if you don't have a family of 10 that will eat 2 or 3 loaves of bread every day. And that's actually what I like to do. I like to put my starter into the fridge right after I use it, so whatever is left in the jar goes into the fridge, and then when I need it again, I take it out, I feed it, and when it peaks or right after, I use it again. There are some people that will tell you that keeping your starter in the fridge the majority of time will make it more acidic or will make it sluggish, but I find that that is not totally true. I do think starters really thrive at room temperature, so if you have the chance to bake a lot, absolutely keep it on the counter, but I've been keeping mine mostly in the fridge. I would say 90% of the time my starter is in the fridge, and maybe it doesn't perform at 100%, it does perform at, I would say, 95. So it's really not as big of a difference. If you have a healthy starter, it should handle being in the fridge the majority of time. And that way you don't actually need to feed it every day. And while we're on the topic of sourdough starter, there's rule number 2 that I often hear about too, and it is that you have to use your starter exactly at its peak. Now again, there's some truth in it. The starter will be the most active, it will raise your bread the best when it's used at peak, but I think so many people get intimidated. How do you know when exactly is it at peak? Because before it starts falling down, it just goes up. And then there's the question of fitting sourdough baking into your schedule and always calculating when do you need to feed it to get it exactly at its peak when you have time to make the dough. I've talked about this before on this channel, but I think the safest way to go is to use your starter right after it peaks, or maybe a few hours even after it peaks. Because if you do use it before it peaks, it is not fully fermented yet, it's not fully active, so it might be really sluggish when you drown it in flour and water and butter, or depending what dough you are making with it. But when it reaches the peak, it means it's fully fermented. And when it starts to fall down, yes, it will become more and more acidic, but this process is quite slow as well. So when it reaches its peak, I think you have at least a few hours to use it successfully and bake great looking loaves. So my suggestion here is to just feed your starter so you'll know it will reach its peak before you need to use it, and then when it reaches the peak, you have the flexibility to use it for a few hours. Sometimes I even put my starter into the fridge right after I use it. And if there's a chance for me to use it again the next day or maybe even after 2 days, I just use the same starter. I don't even feed it again. I just take it out of the fridge and use it straight from the fridge. Since the fridge slows down the fermentation so much, I'm able to get great results even with using that kind of starter because it's not yet flat. After 3 days, it will fall down quite a bit, so in that case, I do feed it again. But my point is that you don't need to use your starter exactly at its peak. You have a lot of flexibility after the peak to use it. The third rule I often see is to use filtered water for either feeding your starter or making your dough, because supposedly tap water will kill your starter and your dough won't rise and your loaf will be flat. This rule is a little bit harder to comment on because tap water does vary from country to country and from area to area. But unless your tap water is heavily chlorinated or it's not drinkable or there's something majorly wrong with it, it should be fine for your sourdough starter. So my rule of thumb is, if it's fine for you to drink, it's probably fine to feed your starter with and to mix your dough with. So if you notice that your starter suddenly is not working as good as it was anymore, absolutely consider that maybe it's the water, but right from the get-go, I wouldn't even worry about it. Another rule in that realm is to never use metal utensils when you're mixing your starter, mixing your dough, etc. Now, I understand that videos about making sourdough bread are more aesthetically pleasing if you're mixing with an ancient wooden spoon, but in real life, that's just not as practical as just using your kitchen spoon. As far as my research goes, I think this rule stems from the past, because in the past some metals were reactive even when they were meant to be used in the kitchen, but nowadays the utensils you have in your kitchen shouldn't be reactive at all, so you should be able to use them without any problems. So the fifth rule is to always use organic bread flour when making sourdough bread. There's a lot to unpack here. First, let's focus on using bread flour. Bread flour is amazing for sourdough bread because it gives the bread structure. The bread will be a little less soft than if you would make it with all-purpose flour, because bread flour does contain more proteins, so those gluten bonds really have a chance to create this beautiful open crumb. Again, the most aesthetically pleasing pictures of sourdough bread are probably breads that are made with bread flour, but I know that where I live, bread flour is difficult to source if you want to find it locally, and it's also quite a bit more expensive. So I decided a long time ago to not use it as much. I still use it for bagels or some other things that I like that have a really nice texture to them. But for my regular loaves that I bake throughout the week, I almost always use a blend of all-purpose flour or some kind of whole wheat flour, and my bread still comes out great. So don't be afraid to use all-purpose flour. You don't need to buy bread flour, but if you want really impressive loaves, you will probably have to at least mix in a bit of bread flour. Now, as far as organic goes, I like to source organic ingredients, so I buy flour from the store that I know carries it from local mills. So I totally understand that if the quality of flour is the concern, you should probably go for organic. But in terms of organic flour being the only one appropriate because your starter will suddenly stop working if the flour is not organic, that's not a concern. The sixth rule is that you have two options with discard. You can either use it in discard recipes or you can throw it away. That's totally not true. You actually have a third option. Since sourdough discard is only water and flour, you can use it in pretty much everything that could benefit from additional water and flour. I have to admit that I'm not left with a lot of discard because I keep my starter in the fridge, so I only feed it when I need it. and there's not a lot of discard I need to necessarily use up. But when I do have some extra, I really like to thicken my sauces or soups or broths with it, because the traditional way would be to thicken them up with flour, but if you use sourdough discard, it's just flour that's already mixed with a bit of water, and I find that that works really great. The thing is, you don't need a special discard pancake recipe or discard Dutch baby recipe, because you are making a large quantity of some type of batter, and if you add a few spoonfuls of sourdough discard, I find that it doesn't ruin the end result. So I like to use it in things like pancakes, or even in yeasted bread doughs, for example. When I'm in a pinch and I bake with yeast, I just mix a little bit of discard in there as well. I'm not relying on it to rise my bread because I'm using yeast for that, but since I'm mixing up the dough that already contains flour and water and salt, why not add a little bit of discard as well? The seventh rule is that you must have a Dutch oven if you want a great looking loaf of sourdough. This is something I thought as well when I started. That's why I bought a Dutch oven specifically for baking sourdough, and while I really love it, and while I think it does create a really beautiful looking loaf, it's absolutely not a necessity. You can bake sourdough in a loaf pan. Maybe you're familiar with a two-loaf method. I have a whole video about it actually, because I find it very practical and very inexpensive if you're just starting with sourdough. You can do open baked loaves by putting some steam in the oven while the loaves are baking. My point is that you don't necessarily need a Dutch oven. The eighth rule is that you have to follow sourdough recipe to a T. So that means you will ferment it for the exact number of hours. You will do the exact number of sets of stretch and folds at exactly 30 minutes intervals. And I'm here to tell you that this is usually not the case. If you're a beginner, maybe stay close to the recommended amount of sets and recommended time between them. But when you kind of develop a feeling for the dough, you can just do them your own way. And maybe your dough will end up being more hydrated or less hydrated than the one in the recipe. And in that case, it's actually beneficial for you to adjust stretch and folds, maybe mix some coil folds in there too, and things like that. The ninth rule is that you cannot use your stand mixer for making sourdough bread. Although there are some videos out there about how to use stand mixer for sourdough bread, there are still people that will say that you absolutely cannot make a loaf with a stand mixer. In my experience, it's just harder to make it with stand mixer, but if you really don't want to get your hands dirty, it's absolutely doable. But what I find really helps is if you turn the mixer on to do the initial mix of ingredients, then turn it off for 30 minutes, maybe even 40 minutes, to give the flour a chance to absorb the water. And then after about 30 or 40 minutes, you turn it on again. And at this point, you should start to see the dough forming some kind of ball if it's not very hydrated. And then you want to mix it for about 10 minutes more to develop the gluten a little bit, and then you can bulk ferment it on the counter for whatever time your recipe says you should. If that's your favorite way of doing bread and you're maybe just transitioning from yeasted bread you've always done in a stand mixer to sourdough bread, maybe try to use a recipe for sourdough bread that has a little less water in it, or adjust it so it will have a little less water, and that way the dough will be more manageable when you're mixing with a stand mixer. The next rule is that you have to buy rice flour in order to flour your Benetton basket and to flour your loaf before you can score it beautifully. I was very curious about that, so I did at one point buy a little bit of rice flour just because I wanted to test it, how it will behave differently from just using regular flour. And while I had a feeling that it was a little easier to spread on a tea towel really beautifully and then on the loaf, and maybe the scoring was a little bit prettier, I still didn't buy rice flour again for that purpose, because I think the benefit that I got from rice flour over all-purpose flour was so small for me that it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth the effort of buying another item. It wasn't worth the effort to pull another flour from my my cabinet when I was making sourdough. So if you're an artistic person that really enjoys doing nice designs on the loaves and decorate them really beautifully, rice flour will probably be a necessity for you because it will make that job easier. But if you just want to bake good loaves with great scoring still, all-purpose flour works just fine. The 11th rule is that you can utilize the fridge when doing sourdough, but only when the recipe says you can. So again, we're talking about how recipe instructions are sometimes very strict, and although they don't say you have other options, you do actually have them. The majority of recipes will have you mix the dough, bulk ferment it, shape it, and then put it into the fridge when it's already shaped, so then you can bake it right after you take it out. And if you are doing cinnamon rolls, for example, the recipe will mostly say that you have to mix the dough up, let it bulk ferment, shape the cinnamon rolls, put them in the fridge for the second rise, and then bake them. When in reality, fridge just pauses fermentation for sourdough. So you can utilize it whenever you need. For example, for cinnamon rolls, there's no problem if it's really late at night when the bulk fermentation is finished, and even though the recipe says that you have to shape them before putting them into the fridge, you can definitely just throw them into the fridge and then shape them the next morning when you have more time on hands. Anything you're making with sourdough, if you don't have time, if something comes up, you can throw it in the fridge and continue later. And the last rule we are going to debunk is that you need a separate recipe for every dough and every sourdough creation you are making. This is actually something that I'm beginning to understand more recently. I've spent probably my whole first year of doing sourdough following different recipes for everything that I made. I kind of thought that each creation has its own recipe, when in reality there are some basic sourdough doughs that you can then use for basically everything you're making. So, for example, if you have a favorite plain sourdough recipe, you can just add inclusions to it. You don't have to follow the recipe for an inclusion loaf necessarily. And lately, for example, I discovered that my favorite brioche dough recipe works for cinnamon rolls, it works for babka, it works for, what did I make recently? I think it was garlic pull-apart bread. My point is that if you have a plain dough recipe that you like and you know how it works and you know how to fit it in your schedule, use it for as many things as you want. And when you find a recipe for cinnamon rolls, for example, that you really like, try to make babka with it, or dinner rolls if you prefer a little richer dinner rolls. There are so many benefits of using the same kind of dough for different creations, because first you will get used to making the dough, so you won't have to look up how many grams of water and flour and butter you need. Then you'll also know how the dough behaves, so you will see that maybe your brioche dough always needs an extra hour or two to ferment compared to your plain bread dough. And the second benefit is that you can then bake in bulk however you want, because you can make a lot of plain bread dough, for example, and you can use 1/3 of that dough for plain loaf, you can use the other third for cinnamon sugar loaf, and you can use the last third for bread rolls or maybe even sourdough bagels. So I think it's really smart if you stumble upon a recipe that gives you a really beautiful dough to work with. Maybe try that dough for different things as well. Maybe experiment a little bit and don't look at the recipe so much, and with practice you'll kind of spontaneously develop your own recipes that you will use all the time in your kitchen, and you'll also be very confident making them because you made them so many times already. So that's it for the rules today. As you can see, I'm quite passionate about the topic because I find it's such a shame that so many people are scared to even try starting to bake with sourdough because they think they need to have this perfect schedule and perfect flour and perfect Dutch ovens and bread lamps and whatnot, when in reality a lot of the things are flexible and you'll need to try it out for yourself and see how sourdough works in practice. And I really hope this video gave you the confidence to start with sourdough and not panic about it if something comes up and maybe there's 33 minutes between your first and second set of stretch and folds. And as always, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below and I will gladly answer them. I love to help, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!